Okay, so for this week, we're going to be looking at European cultural movements that immigrated into America, into these British colonies. In fact, all colonies in North America, whether they're Spanish, French, from the Netherlands, any European presence brought with them this cultural movement of new identities through ideas. So remember, if we looked at the Atlantic world, we saw that that's the exchange of people with the slave trade, or whether by choice or by force. So people coming over, exchanging in that whole world. Goods with tobacco, you can think of that. You can think of all the European goods that were coming into the British colonies, the colonies in general, but also shaping lives of the natives that are around there, being more dependent on European goods. Europeans were consuming cotton and tobacco from the Americas, so goods is huge. But the third strand of all that is ideas, and the exchange of ideas is a huge part of world systems of exchange and what will become known as globalization. When we look at global exchange of goods, people, and ideas, and disease, those all are an important thing that you see in this Atlantic world in the 1700s. So another part of that, besides just consuming of goods and people, these ideas were coming in largely because there's a growth of literacy. You see people reading things, and you see upper echelons of society really getting into science and science-based understanding. The whole new world brought into an existence of a world that people never even dreamed of. So whether it's lands like the Americas or telescopes bringing stars into space closer to reality, but also a microscope that's able to bring things out of view that people didn't even know existed into focus. So technology bringing things in into science. And so people were consuming ideas from the intellectual revolution that's happening at the time just as much as anything else. So we're going to look at that through the Enlightenment, and we're going to look at how the Enlightenment shapes identities in the colonial life, but also how it really lays the format of how America will come to take shape. If you think of the founding fathers and what they're creating when they come up with the Declaration of Independence, when they're looking at the Bill of Rights, when they're looking at the Constitution and everything else, largely that is an experiment of this intellectual ideas. So the intellectual ideas that are looking at political changes, how the best government should be run, the ideas of citizenship, the ideas in sovereignty, all these ideas that we think about in this early American formation comes from these European Enlightenment intellectual ideas that coming about. So we see that being consumed. On the other side of it this week, we're going to look at colonial religion. We're going to look at this great awakening where people, if they weren't reading about intellectual thought, they were consuming religious sermons that really appealed to the emotion. So on one side of the coin, you have the Enlightenment really appealing to reason, and the sermons of this religious movement really appealed to the heart and to emotion. And together were ways to combat the anxieties of not knowing, to combat the anxieties of a world that seems shaky, political turmoil, uneasiness. And they turned to those two things largely to find answers of how to deal with things at a personal level and at a collective cultural level. So I hope that, maybe you can kind of see that in the world around us again today. But in this time period, you really see that coming in. And it wasn't just with white men or white colonial Americans in these colonies. It was everybody. So you see this movement transforming the slave communities in the slave cultures that are happening. And you see that, especially religious fervor, you see this religious enlightenment where stories of Abraham bringing the people out of the chains in Egypt to a promised land really starts to take hold with these stories and songs that come out of this sort of subtle slave resistance movement throughout the 1800s. You also see it really going into native communities. And we're going to read one by Occam, who plays a central role in this Great Awakening, first going to England and dining with kings and being part of this whole system, both in Britain and in colonial life. But when the tides turn and promises were broken to him, he turned his gaze away from colonial America and to the native population, to the native peoples. And he really plays a big role in converting, seeing religion as a way of resilience against colonial oppression, as a resilience to maintain identity in this changing world. And so it's a really interesting thread and important part of this underlining religious movement that's happening across the Atlantic world. So both with the Enlightenment and both religious changes that help really shape identities, that's what we're going to be looking at in this week.